excited that we've got some horse programs going on because I love horses and I love to get to talk to people. And I know that it's probably a little less personal when we're on Zoom than it would be if we were face to face. So what I'm going to do is try to turn on my chat box. But if you have questions as I go along, I really welcome questions. So please feel free to type your questions in the chat box if you can't jump in and say them out loud, because I'd love to answer your questions as we go. So I put my contact information on this first one, the first slide, and on the last one. I love to talk to people, so please feel free to contact me at any time if you have questions or if you need clarification on the slides or anything like that. Just to give you a little background on myself, I grew up on a kind of a hobby farm of my parents. My dad was an equine specialist at Florida, in the University of Florida, and he raised horses, and I started showing jumpers sometime when I was a kid, and then I did it professionally for a while. So I worked in the industry for maybe a decade before I decided to move into academics. So I started here at UGA in 2007, and so this is, on that bottom picture, this is me. This is me now. This was me a few decades ago on the horse. So I do a lot of teaching. I teach a lot of our horse-related classes in animal science, and I answer a lot of questions. So I like to work with horse owners and vets around the state and try to help them, figure out their nutrition problems. So feel free to contact me at any time. What I thought I'd do today, horse nutrition is a big topic, and I don't know what your specific interests are, but I thought I would kind of go through a little bit of a hodgepodge of the things that I usually speak on in different groups, but without going into tons of depth on each thing. And then I will leave some time at the end for questions. So the big topics that I thought we would cover would be the GI tract of the horse and how it's unique and how that affects how we feed them. Kind of the principle of digestion. So when we feed them different food stuff, where does it get digested and what kinds of problems can that cause, or how can we do a better job of that? I want to speak a good amount on forages, so your pasture, your grass, your hay, because even though maybe talking about grass isn't that exciting for everyone, I know that you guys with horses probably spend a lot of time thinking about the grass that you feed your horses. And we'll talk a little bit about forage testing too, and how Ashley can help you with that. It's a great thing to do, especially if you're trying to manage your pasture or trying to buy hay in bulk or things like that. So those are the topics we're going to go into. I thought I would start with a slide of what goes wrong a lot in the industry, because like I said, I did work in the industry for a long time. So I had the opportunity to see I guess mistakes that are often made, and I really didn't honestly know better until I started studying nutrition. But one of the big mistakes that we make in the horse industry is we forget that horses are supposed to be eating forage. That's the main thing that their diet should be based around. So when I say forage, I'm talking about the grass and the hay that you would feed them. And so just a couple rules of thumb. We should always feed our horses a minimum of 1% of their body weight in dry matter each day, and more ideally it should be close to 2%. So what does that equate to in pounds? So if we think of our average horse as being 1,000 pounds, a lot of them are heavier, some of them are lighter, but if we use 1,000 pounds because it's a nice round number, 1% of that would be 10 pounds. 2% of that would be 20 pounds. And so that would be of dry matter. And so if you're feeding, no matter what you're feeding, there's water in it. Hay doesn't have nearly as much water. It's only about 10% water. So if you're thinking about how much hay they should be eating a day, we're looking at probably 13 to 20 plus pounds a day that they should be eating. And so the problem is, a lot of the way that we feed horses is we focus on the grain and we kind of forget about the hay. It's an afterthought. We toss them a little bit in the morning, we toss them a little bit at night, but it wouldn't be as much as they would normally eat on their own. So for our horses that are out on pasture for a majority of the day, especially if it's good quality pasture, this isn't that big a deal. But for some of our horses that live in stalls a lot of the day, this can be a problem if we are not giving them enough roughage. And that's one of the main reasons that our show horses get ulcers is not because they live a more stressful lifestyle, but because we're not feeding them like their GI tract is designed to. So if we look at their GI tract a little more closely, one of my students actually drew this. She was an amazing artist. But if we, I think you guys can probably see my cursor as I go along, but it comes in through the esophagus and it goes into the stomach. Because of that angle that the esophagus meets the stomach, and there's a very tight sphincter here, that's why horses can't vomit. Food doesn't spend very much time in the stomach before it goes into the small intestine, but the stomach is very acidic. It is adapted to be continuously fed, to have a continuous flow of material through it. So the stomach is constantly producing acid, whether there's food in it or not. When the horse is chewing and swallowing, it swallows its spit, it swallows saliva, and that saliva has bicarbonate, sodium bicarbonate, which is a buffer. So if they're chewing a lot, if they're eating throughout the day and chewing, they're swallowing saliva and they're buffering their stomach. If they're only chewing an hour or two in the morning and then an hour or two in the evening, then they sit for a lot of the day without that buffer going into their stomach. And so that's why they're more prone to ulcers. After food leaves the stomach, get my cursor back, it goes into the small intestine. And this is where we need the enzymes that the horse's body makes. We need those to digest most of the food. If the body's enzymes don't digest all of the food, especially all of the sugar and starch, we can run into problems, and we're going to talk about that. The only thing that doesn't get digested in the small intestine is the fiber, and that would be highest in our forages. That fiber goes into the cecum, and there's a lot of microbes, little bugs that live in the cecum, and they break down the fiber and produce a product that the horse can use for energy. From there, the food leaves and goes into the large colon, and really the main purpose of the large colon is to resorb water. So if you end up having a horse that has colitis or some type of inflammation of the colon, they often have severe diarrhea because the colon isn't resorbing or pulling back in that water like it's supposed to. So if we look at the horse's GI tract, the way it sits in their body, if you've ever watched your vet or done it yourself where you've listened to gut sounds, a lot of times they're stronger on the right side of the horse's body, kind of near the flank region, because that's where this cecum is. This pink area right here is the cecum, and that's where the horse is kind of constantly mixing and the microbes are breaking down that fiber and utilizing it for energy. So if we translate that to what the horse eats, if we look at the different components of feed, one of the main things that we focus a lot on in the horse industry is the carbohydrates. And we always hear the term low carb diets. Low carb diets isn't really a good term because really the carbohydrate portion includes both sugars and starches and fiber. So oftentimes when we say low carb, we're really talking about low starch diets. There's a term that you'll see a lot of, it's printed on bags of feed, especially if they claim to be low carb feeds, and that would be NSC. N for non, S for structural, and C for carbohydrates. NSCs are, they've gotten a lot of attention in horse diets for some reasons we're going to talk about, but basically our NSCs are the sugars and starches, and so starch is just a bunch of sugar molecules linked together. These are highest in our grains, and these are ideally digested in the stomach and small intestine, so they never make it to the cecum. Fiber, on the other hand, is highest in our forages, and so just a side note, forage isn't just fiber. So forage has sugars and starches, it has protein, it has fat even, it has vitamins and minerals, but the primary component is the fiber. And that's what we think about when we feed it to horses. So these are the structural carbohydrates, and we call them structural because they're what gives structure to the plant. They're what gives the plant that nice woody stand up in the pasture look. And these are digested in the hindgut, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. So if we look at the difference between starch and cellulose, which is a fiber, They are basically both the same thing in that they're links of glucose molecules. So right here, these little units right here, these are all glucose, sugar. And so starch is linked by what we call an alpha bond. Cellulose is linked together by a beta bond. And basically, the horse has amylase, just like you and I have amylase. That's an enzyme that breaks down starch. So we can digest starch in the small intestine. We don't have an enzyme called cellulase, and the horses don't have an enzyme called cellulase either. So they can't break down fiber. So the fiber basically moves through the horse's GI tract until it gets to the cecum. It's pretty much untouched until it gets to the cecum, just because we don't have an enzyme to break it down. And really, that's the only difference between starch and cellulose. So the problem is that little tiny difference makes a big difference in how it affects the horse's body. So that little tiny bond just being like a Z shape instead of a U shape or whatever makes a big difference in what it does in your horse. And so what happens when the horse breaks down sugar and starch, or breaks down starch into sugar, is that sugar is free glucose. That would be the sugar form in your bloodstream. It goes into the bloodstream, and basically what it does is it causes an increase in blood glucose levels and blood insulin levels. And so we'll talk about that a little bit down the road tonight, because we have in the horse industry, unfortunately, an increasing trend in equine metabolic syndrome, which is insulin resistance in horses. So I feel like about half of my calls anymore are with regards to EMS, equine metabolic syndrome, and insulin. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. The other thing about sugar is that it's undesirable at high levels in a single meal, because we can overload the small intestine to where the small intestine can't absorb it all, to where it gets dumped into the cecum, and that can be a big problem for horses. So again, this is probably more chemistry than I really like to get into, but we're just looking at sugar and starch, and it gets broken down by amylase, ultimately into free glucose. If we compare that to fiber, fiber gets broken down into these molecules down here that are fats, basically, fatty acids. And the horse can use those for energy, and they have the benefit of not causing blood sugar levels to go up and not causing blood insulin levels to go up. So they're kind of a more sustained source of energy, where we don't get like this big sugar rush in the horse. One more thing before we switch away from talking about carbs is this is what lignin looks like. Where would we find lignin? We find lignin in very mature plants. So as plants grow, if you get really into watching your grass, when grass is little, when it's new, when it's young, it's very tender and very pliable and very sugary. And as it gets taller, it gets stiffer. And if you've ever looked at grass that was like waist high on you, it would be very stiff and very woody. Because what happens is as it grows, it develops more and more lignin, which is basically what gives trees their bark, their wood structure. I'm not a tree person, sorry if I messed that up. But it gives grass a lot of structure too. And the reason that it's not good to have in horse diets is because this is what the structure looks like. It is completely indigestible to horses, to the microbes in the cecum. Basically, it just passes through the gut and out into the manure. So what that means is if you're trying to feed a good quality forage to your horse, the biggest thing you want to be concerned about is at what height it was cut at or grazed at. So when you go to buy hay, if you buy hay and you see a lot of seed heads on your hay, that was cut at a time when it was very mature. Seed heads are the last thing that form on the plant, right? It grows up, it gets mature, and then it produces the seed heads. So if you're trying to go buy hay and picking it based on seed heads that you recognize, you just need to know that you're buying kind of poor quality hay because it was cut when it was very mature and very woody. Same thing with your pastures. If you let them get really tall and seed heads on it, the grass is a lot poorer quality. It doesn't provide as many nutrients to your horse as if you keep it in more of a vegetative state at a lower height where it's still young and growing. So a question that maybe people don't ask me enough is, does a horse need grain? And we get so focused in the horse industry on picking the grain, and it's expensive. So I think we think we're doing the right thing by buying an expensive grain for our horse. But the reality is horses are really adapted to not need grain if they're getting good quality forage. Even a lot of our working horses can do fine without having grain if they're being fed a good quality forage. So a rule of thumb that people should be aware of is if we do need to feed grain, and so why would we need to feed grain? We would need to feed grain if we were feeding good quality forage at as much as the horse will consume and they're still not holding their weight well. Then that would be a reason to feed them some grain. And if we're feeding them grain, what we want to do is feed them no more than 0.5% of their body weight at a time if it's a traditional feed. And so I got to qualify that for a minute. But let's figure out what 0.5% of body weight is. 0.5% of body weight would be about 5 pounds for a 1,000-pound horse. So when you start doing the math, how many times a day do I need to feed my horse? Do I need to feed him twice a day? Can I get by with once a day? It really depends on how much you're feeding them. If you can feed them less than 5 pounds and they hold their weight okay, there's really no reason to feed them twice a day unless you just want to. But if you need to feed them more than that, then you've got to break it into multiple feedings. But the caveat is it says of a traditional grain. And that would be if it had one of these ingredients as the main source of calories in the feed, oats, corn, or barley, because these are our high starch feeds. There's a lot of newer feeds that are marketed now that they're popular, that would be high fiber feeds, complete feeds, which are designed to be fed as standalone and replace forage. Those can all be fed at a higher rate because you don't run the risk of overloading the cecum with sugar. So you've got to understand what the ingredients are and really read the feed tag. But let's talk about what happens, why that 0.5% of body weight is important if you're feeding an oat or corn or barley-based feed, like what kind of problems it can cause. Because I'm sure a lot of you have heard the whole issue of a horse getting into the feed bin and overeating, and then having problems with laminitis. There's a lot of reasons that horses can have issues with laminitis. Oh, it's running through without me. There's a lot of issues that can cause laminitis besides a straight overload of starch. So this is only one of the reasons. And I don't know why it just ran through. It's doing that without me. But let me walk you through the process. If you had a horse that got a very large grain meal, especially if the main ingredient was something like corn or oats or barley, something that was high in sugar and starch rather than high in fiber, what happens is that sugar and starch should be digested in the small intestine. But if we overload that small intestine, some of it gets through without being digested in the small intestine. And if that happens with a lot of it gets not digested in the small intestine, it gets dumped into the cecum. So if sugar and starch if sugar and starch gets digested in the small intestine, then it just goes into the bloodstream as glucose. And so if a horse doesn't have problems, it utilizes this glucose well as an energy source. But if all of a sudden we overload it, what happens is the sugar and starch that is not digested in the small intestine goes to the cecum, and the microbes ferment it. And when they ferment sugar, instead of producing volatile fatty acids, which are an energy source that the horse can use, they produce lactic acid. And that lactic acid is very acidic, and it drops the pH of the cecum way down. It causes what we call lactic acidosis. And then that drop in pH kills off a lot of the microbes that are used to a nice neutral pH. And so when it kills off these microbes, they release endotoxins, and those endotoxins get out in the bloodstream. And basically we end up with a condition called endotoxemia, which is toxins in the bloodstream, and that can result in laminitis. So that's kind of the short version on why your horse, if it overeats a large amount of a starchy feed, why it can founder. And so that's kind of where we got the basis for our rule of thumb of don't feed more than about 5 pounds at a time to a horse of a traditional grain. There's a few other ways that a horse can get laminitis that are nutrition related, and we'll touch upon those a little bit later. A couple other nutrients that I want to just mention, protein. Protein, there's a lot of questions and misunderstanding about protein. The main reason that we have protein in feed is because it builds muscle, it builds hair. Like most of our body is made up of protein. Most of our horse's body is made up of protein. We get really a little bit overly focused on protein in the horse industry because our bags of feed are labeled that way. So if you ask somebody, hey, what kind of feed are you feeding? They'll say a 12% sweet feed or a 14% sweet feed or a 10% pellet or something like that. But it's always that protein percent that we label our feeds by. And the reason for that is because it's one of the more expensive ingredients that we put in our bag of feed. But I think it gets us maybe a little bit overly focused on protein because most horses, especially most mature horses, they have their protein needs met by the forage that they're eating. Some of our horses that have increased protein needs that we need to be, mindful of making sure that they get enough protein would be our growing horses. Our lactating mares because they're putting protein in their milk for their growing foal. Our pregnant mares, like very late in gestation, have increased protein needs. I put on here working horses, but the reality is working horses really don't have a tremendously elevated protein requirement. Their protein requirement is elevated a little bit, but their energy requirement is elevated a lot more than their protein needs are. So just by feeding them more feed to meet their energy requirement, usually you meet their protein requirement as well. And then our senior horses tend to be on a higher protein and a better quality protein feed to kind of combat that loss of muscle that goes along with aging. A couple things that are worth pointing out. Feeding higher levels of protein does not make a horse hot and excitable. It won't turn your horse into this bucking horse over here. I have talked to more than one person who will try to reduce the protein intake or the protein percentage of their feed like a 10% feed because they think it's going to make their horse quieter. So that would be like, I have children. If I give them a chicken drumstick, it doesn't really amp them up. But if I give them candy, it does. So it's the same thing with our horses. Increasing the protein percent doesn't make them more energetic. It's actually the hardest nutrient to break down and utilize. Another myth is that if we feed them more protein, it's going to build their top line and make them more muscular. More muscular. That really is only true if they're deficient to start with. And if they're deficient to start with, you would notice other symptoms like poor hair quality, poor hoof quality, things like that. Just increasing the protein, that would be wonderful. I would love to be able to take a protein shake and build muscle myself, but it doesn't really work, and it doesn't really work in horses either. And again, this thing that I already talked about, that their needs really aren't increased that much by exercise. For some of our horses that we are really restricting, like we're putting a grazing muzzle on and we're trying to restrict their intake and some things like that, a ration balancer is a great way to make sure that you're meeting their protein and vitamin and mineral needs, because a ration balancer is designed to be fed at a small rate, like 0.5 pound to 1 pound a day, but it's high in protein. So our horse feeds might be 10, 12, 14% protein. A ration balancer is usually 30% protein, and it usually has vitamins and minerals. So if you've got one of those horses that you're really trying to restrict to their intake to make them lose weight, but you want to make sure that they still get enough protein, vitamins, and minerals, a ration balancer is a great way to do that. Just talking about one more nutrient that comes up a lot in horse feeds, that would be fat. We usually add fat to the diet because it's a great energy source, and we can add calories to the horse pretty easily without adding a lot of sugar and starch. So the downside to having fiber in the diet, we need fiber. I've talked about all the great things about it, but the caloric content of fiber is a lot lower than starch and a lot lower than fat. So if we're trying to add calories to the horse's diet, we can do that by adding fat. And horses handle fat well. Some numbers that I hate to get hung up on, but the energy density, the calories provided are more than twice that of sugars and starches. In our unsupplemented feed, like forages, they have our grass and our hay is about 1 to 2% fat. Grains like oats, corn, that kind of thing range between 2 and 3% fat. So we usually have to add oil to feed to get rice bran is another way we can add fat. Rice bran and oil are kind of our main ways that we're adding fat to the equine diet. Sometimes you'll see flaxseed, and we'll talk about that in a minute because it's high in omega-3 fatty acids. And a couple important things to realize: when you're adding these ingredients, you're just mainly adding calories. So you really need to make sure you know what you're doing, or you buy a bag of feed that's already formulated to have the fat in it, rather than just pouring oil on your horse's feed. Because when you just pour oil over the feed, you're adding a lot of calories, but you're not really adding any other nutrients. There's this little thing down here I thought I would at least mention. If any of you show high performance horses, you can add fat at a pretty high level to get what we call a glycogen sparing effect. So if any of you are runners, you maybe have carb loaded, where you try to really boost your muscle glycogen stores before a race. Horses, we don't really carb load. They don't carb load well, and we run into issues of giving them too much sugar and it causing laminitis. So we don't carb load horses. But one of the ways that we can preserve their glycogen stores is to put them on a high fat diet and get them acclimated to utilizing fat as an energy source during exercise. And so this really mainly pertains to our really hardworking horses that we're really trying to get maximal performance out of. And you got to feed them a grain with a pretty high fat percentage, 10% or better, to have that happen. So if you fall in that boat, that little nugget's for you.
I was gonna say my grain is only at 8% fat.
Yeah, if you really want a glycogen sparing effect, the rule of thumb is that 5% of their total diet should be fat. And so if you figure your hay is about 1%, you've got to get your grain up above 10% to really get that glycogen sparing effect. At least that's what research has shown. But you're still going to add energy to the feed at 6% or 8% or something like that. The other reason we sometimes play around with fat in the horse diet is to have an anti-inflammatory effect. So sometimes if your horse has some type of inflammatory issue like skin disorders, arthritis, heaves, there's a lot of different inflammatory conditions that people will play around with trying to add omega-3s. And just to kind of show you the science behind that, if we look at omega-6s and omega-3s going through the same inflammation pathway, if we look at the end products of omega-3s, they are anti-inflammatory, the blue ones here, the blue starred ones. If we look at the end product of omega-6s, they are pro-inflammatory. And the bottom line is we need both anti-inflammatory and pro-inflammatory agents in our body. We can't have all of one versus all of the other. Like, we need inflammation to help heal, to help blood clotting, things like that. But when we get overly skewed towards pro-inflammatory, that's when we might want to try to modify. That's when we might take anti-inflammatory drugs, for example. So in human diets, this has been looked at a lot. Honestly, the research is still kind of mixed even in human diets. In horse diets, I would have to say that there's not a lot of research to support omega-3s. When we look at what horses eat compared to what people eat, their ratio is not as out of balance. So we tend to eat a lot of fried food with corn oil and some of our different vegetable oils, and these are very high in omega-6s, whereas horse diets tend to be higher in omega-3s if they're on a forage-based diet. That being said, when we start putting them on a high grain diet, we start to shift that towards omega-6s a little bit. So if you have a horse that has an inflammatory condition, I would say give it a try. And the way you give it a try is with something like flaxseed. But just recognize that there's not a lot of research out there that really supports that right now. I think we already talked about that. Okay, last little nutrient that we're going to talk about before we get into maybe some specifics on forages is vitamins and minerals. The horse synthesizes a lot of its own vitamins, and if it's out on pasture, it gets the rest of them. So we don't really necessarily need to supplement vitamins to horses, except if they're in stalled conditions eating hay. And in that case, we usually supplement A and E. The rest of them, they pretty much make themselves. Minerals do need to be supplemented. So our pasture horses need to have access to either a loose mineral mix or be fed a ration balancer or something like that. I put some ingredients on here just so when you're going to buy feed, you would know what types of feed you would, or what the ingredients do in your feed. I'm not going to probably go through all of them, but when you're looking at a bag of feed, it's good to know what the fiber ingredients are, what the starch ingredients are, and what the protein ingredients are. So I kind of put that on there just for your own reference. A few bad feeding practices that we should run through really quickly because people do it and don't realize it's bad. Feeding single grains is not recommended. So if you're feeding your horse something like straight oats, it's not really recommended because grains are high in phosphorus and forages are high in calcium. But in general, what we don't want is to ever have more phosphorus than calcium in our ratio. And when we feed single grains, we can certainly do that. We can really screw up our calcium phosphorus balance. So all of our formulated feeds are formulated to have adequate calcium to balance out the phosphorus. But if we feed single grains, we can really mess that up. Same thing with cutting formulated feed. So if you take a bag of feed that's been balanced and then add some oats to it to stretch it or mix some feeds together, that's also not recommended because you kind of mess up the mineral balance in that. I think I'll skip on just in the interest of time, and I can come back to that if you guys have questions. I put a helpful website on here. If you want to really get into balancing your own horse's diet, this is a great resource to help you. You can put in your horse's weight, what they do, what they're eating, and basically kind of do some of the ration balancing yourself. I wanted to spend just a little bit of time talking about forages, and then hopefully I'll stop in the next 10 minutes to leave time for some questions. When we talk about forages, we basically have grasses and we have legumes. And I've kind of given you a list of grass hays, and I've just given you a list of legume hays. The biggest difference in these would be that legumes have higher levels of protein. They fix nitrogen and they have higher levels of protein. They also, to some degree, have more calories, kind of depending on the legume. I put down a few different considerations with some of these that are worth pointing out. When we're feeding Bermuda grass, there are different varieties of Bermuda grass. So things like Coastal, Russell, Alicia, these are all forms of Bermuda grass. Some people get hung up on whether or not Bermuda grass causes colic in horses. And when I'm talking about Bermuda grass, I'm talking about hay. Pasture's really never been a consideration or concern. But I don't ever give a strong opinion on whether or not Bermuda grass causes colic. The problem with Bermuda grass is it's very, very common in the Southeast. So when horses come in for impaction colics, especially in the Southeast, the majority of them are impacted with Bermuda grass. But whether it's a cause or just a result of Bermuda grass being so common down here is what people tend to take issue and debate. If it does cause impaction colic, the reason is probably because it's very fine stemmed and horses might not chew it well enough. So especially horses that tend to bolt their feed and eat very quickly, especially on winter nights where they might not drink as well, they may not chew it well enough and it might get balled up and not have enough saliva to push it through. So there's a lot of good management practices that you can do to prevent that, like adding salt to their feed on cold nights, making sure to put hay out slowly rather than waiting until the grass dies and then putting a big round bale up for them to gorge. But anyway, we can talk more about that if you have questions. Timothy and orchard grass are very acceptable forages for horses. The problem is they don't grow around here, so that's why they're more expensive if you go to buy them in Georgia. Tall fescue is a very appropriate forage for any horse except broodmares and late gestation because it can interfere with the foal being born and it can interfere with milk production. Ryegrass is an excellent forage, very high energy density, but it can be high in sugar. So if you're feeding a horse that's insulin resistant, it's not a good choice. Of our legumes, these are all very good options except clover. Red clover can cause slobbers in horses, like a lot of salivation. So just be aware of that, especially if you have it in your pasture. Not that you need to get rid of it, you just need to recognize what it causes. When we go to pick forage, the main thing that we need to do when we're determining quality is figure out if it was harvested at an appropriate state of maturity for all the reasons I talked about before. But basically, you want that that grass or that forage should have been cut before it got overly woody and stiff and has a high lignin concentration. Obviously, we already probably know this, but we don't want dust and weeds and mold and stuff like that. This just kind of shows you the stage that plants go through if you wanted to watch plants grow. But we go from kind of a young leafy plant to a very stemmy woody plant. And as we go from leafy to this bloom stage where we have seed heads, the plant becomes very stemmy and very woody, and at that point is not a good quality forage for our horses. If we wanted to buy hay in bulk, this is where I've got to put a plug in for Ashley because she can help you with this. If you have concerns or if you're interested, if you buy hay from the same place every year and you want to test it and see how good a quality it is, you can take a forage sample and you can send it to a lab, and it's relatively inexpensive to get a forage result back on quality. The big thing that you're looking for is the digestible energy. So if you guys do cattle stuff, you see TDN used a lot, but in horses, we use digestible energy. So you want to make sure you put that it's for a horse when you send in your sample. But we're mainly looking at two measures of fiber on the forage report called the ADF and the NDF. The other thing that we want to look at is to see that our crude protein kind of falls in the correct range for a grass, which would be, it says 10 to 16, but it's more like 8 to 16 would be average. And a legume would be closer to 20% crude protein. The other thing on a forage report that you really want to pay attention to is the amount of moisture. Because if it gets too dry, like less than 10%, the leaves kind of fall off, and the leaves are where all the good stuff is in the plant. But if it gets too wet, like close to 20% or more, then we end up with mold problems or even worse, combustion problems. So we've all unfortunately seen barn fires that happen from spontaneous combustion from hay. It's because that hay was too wet most of the time. Here's a table that you can look at your leisure if you want. The big thing when we're looking at forage, the easiest thing to remember is this 20-40-60 rule down here. If we get a forage report back and we want to make sense of the numbers really quickly, we just look and make sure that the moisture is less than 20%, the ADF is less than 40%, and the NDF is about 60%, ideally under it, but for some of our warm season grasses, it might be a little bit higher. And if it meets this criteria, it's a reasonable quality hay to feed your horse. When we look at the different types of hay that are out there, this is just a quick table that I pulled somewhere. What I want to draw your attention to is that a lot of these different types of hay, we spend a lot of time sometimes worrying about what type of hay we're feeding and whether or not it's the best. What you'll see is they're not that dissimilar to each other. And so our legume hays tend to be a little bit higher in digestible energy, but some of our grass hays can get up that high if they're managed well and cut at an earlier state of maturity. And sometimes the hays we pay more for, like Timothy or orchard grass, actually, Timothy has the lowest digestible energy on this table. So we've got to not get hung up in thinking that if we pay more for hay, it's a better quality hay. What usually makes hay cost more is that it doesn't grow around here and you have to pay to freight it in. That tremendously drives up the cost. The other thing you want to do if you have the ability, is recognize what kind of horses you're feeding and then pick your hay based on what kind of horse you're feeding. So our really premium alfalfa hay probably doesn't need to be fed to kind of our idle horses standing out in a pasture. That might be a really appropriate hay for a lactating broodmare or a growing horse. So just recognize whether or not your horse really needs the best quality forage or not. If you have one of those freaks that's, I hate to say freak, I have one in my barn, that's sugar sensitive, that's insulin resistant, that you're having to work hard to manage, you can have your hay carbohydrate tested. There's a lot of different parameters that I put on here just so you understand what is out there. But honestly, if you call me and ask me, the only thing we have recommendations for is this NSC value, non-structural carbohydrates, which are the water-soluble carbohydrates plus starch. If you have an NSC value, I can help you. I can tell you whether it's close to what it needs to be or not. But for our sugar-sensitive, insulin-resistant horses, we want NSC to be about 10%, which is really low and really hard to get to. but it gives you a guideline to shoot towards. For horses that don't have problems, we don't need to get too hung up on that. Just to kind of show you the mechanism behind, I know I'm running out of time here, just to show you the mechanism behind why insulin-resistant horses can have carbohydrate issues. If we look at sugars bonded with this, alpha bond, they get broken down into free glucose. That free glucose goes into the bloodstream. And then I put together this cute little schematic. Once glucose is in the bloodstream, insulin binds to the cell. It causes some reactions that basically allows glucose to go into the cell. And that's the way a normal horse works. In our insulin-resistant horses, we have insulin that binds because glucose is in the bloodstream, but that reaction doesn't happen. So those GLUT transporters don't open, so glucose stays outside of the cell, and then we get more glucose that builds up, and then more insulin builds up, and pretty soon we have a condition called hyperglycemia and hyperinsulinemia. So that just means that there's a lot of glucose in the blood and a lot of insulin in the blood. And the problem with that is insulin affects your blood vessels. It can cause vasoconstriction and vasodilation, but in these horses that get hyperinsulinemia, vasoconstriction is what happens. And that basically means that the blood flow is reduced to the horse's hooves, and that affects that bone right there, that coffin bone that's in your horse's foot. And so what it does is it can cause the lamina in the hoof to basically weaken and kind of tear away. And then that bone doesn't stay like it should, parallel to the hoof wall. It instead rotates and sinks, it can cause chronic problems, right? It can cause death if it's severe enough. So that's why on these horses that are sugar sensitive, we have to really manage them and keep that NSC level down. We'll skip over the pasture fructan now. A couple things about managing horses. When grass is the most dangerous is in the afternoon when it's bright and sunny, because it photosynthesizes all day long, so it builds up its sugar. If it's a warm night, then the sugar gets used up, and so first thing in the morning would be kind of your lowest sugar content, your best time to graze. If it's a cold night, that's not really true, but this gets into a lot more specific management than we probably need to. I put this table in here just to give you kind of a quick rundown of the NSC levels of different feeds and hays. Again, remembering that for our insulin-resistant horses, we're shooting for about 10%, which you see it's hard to do because nothing on this table is 10%. But you can certainly see the things that are high, that are not close to 10%. And that would be things like oats and corn, some of these grain ingredients. Whereas some of our, like alfalfa hay, beet pulp, some of our forage sources are a little bit lower. Okay, I think I'm going to go ahead and stop with that right now, because the next few things just talk about planting your pasture, and I kind of go through and talk about what you can plant in pastures, and when to fertilize, how to soil test, some things like that. All of those things are totally in Ashley's wheelhouse. And so if you want help, assistance, getting your pasture planted, figuring out fertilizer and lime needs and things like that, she is a real asset to you. She can help you. So I'd like to stop with like 15 minutes left so I can take questions. And I'm sorry that was a whirlwind.
No, that was perfect. That was really great. Thank you so much. And I will go ahead and say about pasture management, if you have questions now, don't hesitate to contact me. But we will be doing a pasture management webinar series in March. So we will discuss specific pasture management in the early spring, and then we will also kind of do that full year cycle. So if you want more now, you can contact me, but you know, getting in that March time is a good time to go ahead and start on your pastures. So I have a question personally. So alfalfa cubes and pellets versus alfalfa hay, is there a difference, or is that, you know, something we should be concerned about, you know, feeding to our horses? Because for me, alfalfa hay is a little difficult to feed, and the cubes and the pellets are just so convenient.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the difference is just the particle size of the cube versus the hay versus the pellet. So it really becomes the biggest issue with senior horses, because some of our senior horses don't have enough teeth to really glean anything from the hay itself. So we'll wet down the cubes, and that works really well. And I'm not trying to discourage people from feeding the pellets. The only difference there is that the particle size in the pellet is very small. It's ground up. So there is some benefit to long stem forages, having that particle length be a little bit longer. And the cube counts as long stem forage, just long enough to still stimulate the GI tract, to stimulate the contractions that help move food through it. So I guess my preference would be, if you're not feeding anything else, like any other forages that would be long stemmed, that you go to the cube instead of the pellet. But some of it is a matter of what your horse will eat too.
Yeah, my horse, I have found a softer cube so that it's not so, like I don't have to wet it so much and let it soak. I can just throw it in there and sprinkle it with a little bit of water, and it just breaks up so easy, and they just have a lot of chewing action to stimulate that saliva production.
Oh, what did you find? What product? I had this problem with my old horse because he won't touch wet feed.
It's a D&D Nutrition.
Okay.
And it's I think it's out of Oklahoma or Texas out west, and they have an extruded alfalfa based feed, but they also have cubes that they can get. They're called Alpha Lux cubes, and they're alfalfa. It's sun cured. I really like it. So not to plug that, but just it's an option for a softer cube.
Yeah, no, I right now, if you have a horse that won't touch wet down alfalfa cubes, because some of our older horses don't, an option is to break it up with a hammer. I have done that a lot with my old horse, sitting it on just like an anvil or something like that and hammering the cubes until they break up a little bit. But it sounds like Ashley's product might work better.
Yeah, those ones from Tractor Supply or your local feed store, they're just so briquette hard. Like they're just so tightly compacted. So, all right. Does anybody in our audience have questions? You're more than welcome to type it in the chat box or unmute yourself and ask any questions.
This is Cynthia Brayton. Kylee, I know about a metabolic horse, and it has been really tough. It's laminitic, insulin resistant, Cushing's, throw it all in there. You know, we had been around and around with that, but we've settled on a low starch feed, which has really worked actually for the mares. This is a gelding for the other two mares. They're fine with it. They're happy to have it. They have some grass, but also what we landed on was a hay that was a combination, 10% alfalfa and Timothy. Oh, it's expensive. It comes from Utah and Nebraska, but you know the bugs are killed in it because it snows hard out there. But that has really helped. We've had to have him on Equiox he's 20 years old. And what are your thoughts on any kind of inflammatories like Equiox?
So that's good for, like, if you're trying to keep him on a long-term anti-inflammatory, that's a lot better than Bute. Like Bute, which would be, you know, your normal short-term anti-inflammatory, can cause ulcers because it not only inhibits the COX-2 pathway, which is your inflammatory pathway, but it inhibits COX-1, which is the stomach lining turnover. So that's why Bute on a long-term basis can cause ulcers. So your Previcox, Equiox, that would be the right strategy if you're trying to really handle like arthritis for a long-term thing. You can try something like flaxseed. I've heard mixed results on whether or not the omega-3s help. I always tell people it's worth a try, but I wouldn't hold my breath thinking that it is, because the research is really mixed on whether or not you're going to get any beneficial effect. And I don't know if is it joint disease, joint issues that you're trying to handle with the anti-inflammatories?
Yes, just because of age and having him being having laminitis, it's a lot of things to juggle. We use Dr. Robin Barrow out of Social Circle, and she's really helped us to come up with a formula, and it really is a formula for what the horse is. But then you realize you've got other horses that are fine. My ones are
Right.
such, they're easy keepers, they're fine, but they get plenty of hay, and that's enough. You know, when they go out in the pasture, there's not much grass left, and especially the insulin resistant horse and laminitic can't get a lot of hay because of the sugar. So we've
Right.
had to manage all that, but he's doing great. We finally, it took 2 years to figure out what was wrong with him and what was going on as he's aging, but so
Well,
far,
I
so good.
would say if it's working, I wouldn't change. But if you start having problems again, one of the things that there's not a lot of research, but I've looked into it a little bit, and I have a friend who's a vet that treats Cushing's horses. Supplement vitamin E versus like on horses that would be like, so if a horse is out on fresh forage, the vitamin E they're getting is very high. As soon as you pull them off and put them on hay, your vitamin E really drops down, and vitamin E plays a role in vasodilation. So if you start having problems again, I would recommend looking into vitamin E, especially the natural form. So the form that you get in feed is a synthetic blend, and it's not that bioavailable. There are natural sources of it, but they're expensive. So if you're doing fine, I wouldn't necessarily go spending money. But if you're looking for other things, that might be something to try. And then, of course, there's always joint supplements, and I can go into a lot of discussion on different joint supplements. But they're a little bit buyer beware. The only one that has FDA approval, where there's been testing that's backed it up, is Equine, which is the intermuscular injection versus the oral.
Right.
But that's not to say that some oral supplements won't work. It's just that they don't have the research behind them that Equine has.
Right. I've used it before. My other horse, she was showing. I showed her a lot, performance horse. So.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. This has been really helpful.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else have a question or a comment for Dr. Duberstein before we end? All right. Well, and if you have any questions following this presentation, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, and I can forward those on and find the answers for you. So thank you all for joining us this evening, and be on the lookout for the December one. We're going to be talking about ulcer prevention and talking about what causes ulcers in performance horses and horses of all walks of life. So be looking for that. And Dr. Duberstein, thank you so much for being on tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it a lot. It was nice talking to y'all. And like I said, feel free to contact me. I love to chat with people.
Perfect. All right, y'all have a great evening.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.